What if I told you that one of America's most well-known self-proclaimed prophets, a man adored by thousands, a leader with unshakable influence, is now at the center of a scandal so dark it almost defies belief? Reports are exploding that this so-called shepherd of souls has been accused of running a multi-million-dollar slavery ring right inside the walls of his own church. This isn't just another church controversy. It's a shocking story that has shaken faith communities nationwide, left followers questioning everything, and sparked a firestorm of outrage across social media. How could something this horrifying happen under the cover of ministry? And what does it mean for the thousands who once trusted him as their spiritual guide? Tonight, we pull back the curtain and reveal the truth behind the accusations that are sending shockwaves through the church world. The FBI has confirmed the unthinkable. David E. Taylor, once hailed by thousands as a divine prophet and miracle worker, has been arrested at the center of a jaw-dropping $50 million church scandal. What investigators uncovered goes far beyond money. It's a chilling story of control, abuse, and exploitation that has left entire communities shaken and raised terrifying questions about the hidden world of modern-day megachurch culture. For years, Taylor built his empire by presenting himself as God's messenger, a healer with supernatural power, a leader promising hope and transformation. Followers abandoned careers, drained their bank accounts, and even walked away from their families to serve his vision. But according to federal authorities, the ministry was nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion, a front for manipulation, financial fraud, and what experts are calling modern-day slavery. The arrest has not only shattered the lives of those who trusted him, but may also ignite a reckoning that shakes the entire religious landscape. While followers lived in poverty and fear, allegations range from psychological manipulation and unpaid labor to extravagant spending on expensive cars, designer suits, and multi-million-dollar properties. We'll cover all the essential details of this scandal in today's in-depth analysis. We'll go over the FBI's investigation process, the startling testimony of former members, the money trail that ultimately led to Taylor's demise, and the potential prison term he may now face. This is more than just a tale of one fallen leader, so stay with me. It serves as a warning about power, blind faith, and the disastrous results of unbridled authority. And believe me, you'll understand why this case is regarded as one of the most explosive scandals in the history of the modern church by the end of this video. We must first examine David E. Taylor, the man at the heart of the controversy, in order to appreciate its seriousness. Taylor was born in the 1970s and came from a humble upbringing, very different from the opulence he later surrounded himself with. He claims that as a teenager, he had a vision of Jesus Christ that changed his life. According to him, this experience changed his life and led him on a divine quest. His ministry was built on that story, which was later recited, acted out, and broadcast to thousands of believers who believed he was their chosen one. Taylor started giving sermons in small groups, frequently combining impassioned discourse with assurances of healings, miracles, and face-to-face interactions with God. He immediately attracted attention with his charisma and audacious claims. He founded Joshua Media Ministries International, or JMMI, in the early 2000s. It appeared to be a strong spiritual movement devoted to prayer, revival, and sharing the gospel from the outside. Behind the scenes, however, ex-members claimed that JMMI was more akin to a cult, where it was unthinkable to question Taylor and his word was final. Taylor developed a reputation as a contemporary prophet through conferences, televised sermons, and glitzy marketing collateral. He claimed to have visited heaven and had frequent in-person encounters with Jesus. These remarkable assertions were not limited to spiritual guidance. They were effective promotional instruments. The prospect of being associated with a man who professed to have a direct line to God himself appealed to those in dire need of meaning, healing, and hope. Taylor's ministry started to flourish financially. Contributions poured in, sometimes in the form of modest gifts from low-income families and other times in the form of large sums from affluent followers who felt they were contributing to the establishment of God's kingdom. In the belief that their sacrifice would result in blessings, some members donated their homes, retirement funds, and life savings, according to court documents and former members. Taylor had a great deal of power because of his financial reliance and loyalty. According to reports, he had a multi-million-dollar mansion, designer suits, pricey cars, first-class travel, and an extravagant lifestyle. Additionally, according to insiders, he rarely practiced sacrifice himself, despite preaching it to his congregation. Rather, his wealth and power only grew stronger. However, as Taylor's empire grew, so did the rumors of mistreatment. Former members started to tell unsettling tales of being separated from their families, being made to work long hours without compensation, and being told that defying Taylor equated to defying God. What started out as a religious movement gradually began to resemble a high-control organization, what some would daringly refer to as a cult, rather than a church. The FBI's interest started to develop at this point, because federal authorities begin to take notice when millions of dollars are at stake and when it is alleged that vulnerable people are being exploited. However, how did the investigation start? Who was the first to raise the alarm? When the FBI began to peel back the layers of Taylor's multi-million-dollar ministry, what did they find? At that point, the situation becomes even more dire. From the outside, David Taylor's rise may have appeared unstoppable, but every empire has weaknesses. And when courageous former members started speaking up, those cracks became visible for Taylor. There had been rumors of abuse within Joshua Media Ministries International for years. According to several reports, former adherents recount being overworked, coerced, and silenced out of fear of divine retribution. However, these testimonies were disregarded for a long time. Ultimately, Taylor was a charismatic leader with thousands of devoted followers who would brush off any criticism as an attack on a godly man. When a few whistleblowers decided they could no longer keep quiet, everything changed. Some had given up everything they owned and severed their family ties in order to spend years inside the ministry. They left with financial wounds in addition to emotional and spiritual ones. They asserted that they had lost their money, their autonomy, and even their sense of value. According to one former member's testimony, she was made to work 16-hour days without pay cleaning, cooking, and even performing manual labor for Taylor's properties. Another said she was told that keeping money for herself was a sign of disobedience to God and that she was under pressure to turn over her bank accounts. The picture painted by these accusations was one of horror. On the surface, the ministry appeared to be holy, but in reality, it was more akin to contemporary slavery. Journalists, lawyers, and ultimately federal investigators heard these testimonies eventually. The FBI secretly started keeping an eye on Taylor's group. They began compiling a case, interviewing former members, and monitoring financial records. The discoveries they made were astounding. Court documents claim that the ministry was functioning as a $50 million fraud and manipulation-fueled empire. It has been reported that donations intended for God's work were diverted to lavish real estate, expensive travel, luxury spending, luxury cars, and designer clothes. According to former members, Taylor even paid for spa treatments, cosmetic surgery, and other personal indulgences with ministry funds. The most startling revelation, though, may have been how the ministry supposedly managed its employees. Investigators claim that because followers believed that outsiders were adversaries attempting to divert them from God's plan, they were under pressure to sever their ties with their families. There was unwavering devotion to Taylor within the ministry. Dissidents faced humiliation, shame, and occasionally the threat of eternal damnation. Subsequently, the FBI characterized it as a psychological captivity system in which victims felt compelled to comply. Another concerning detail came to light during the investigation. It's possible that not all of the purported donations were given voluntarily. Investigators believe that members were defrauded, forced, or manipulated into giving up their assets. While Taylor and his inner circle lived like royalty, vulnerable people who already had little money were sometimes left penniless. However, the leak of financial documents marked a sea change. Documents that revealed significant differences between Taylor's actual spending and what the ministry told the IRS. These documents provided investigators with the evidence they required to take action. The FBI was ready to move in after months of financial audits, interviews, and surveillance. The earthly reality of federal charges was about to befall Taylor, the self-styled prophet who claimed to have spoken directly to Jesus. When the arrest did occur, it was not only startling, but also historic. However, we must first examine the actual experience of life for the members of Joshua Media Ministries, before moving on to that momentous occasion, because the real human cost of Taylor's empire is exposed by those unsettling first-hand reports. David E. has a far darker reality when you look past the dazzling stage lights, the well-rehearsed sermons, and the claims of miracles. The ministry of Taylor, Joshua Media Ministries International, was a doorway to heaven on earth for his devoted followers. However, it was a prison of exploitation, manipulation, and terror for those who managed to get out. The culture described by former members is one of total control. Taylor was more than just a clergyman. His words carried the weight of God himself, and he was portrayed as a divine authority figure. It wasn't only considered disrespectful to question him, it was regarded as spiritual disobedience. And that kind of pressure was sufficient to keep those who genuinely thought he had direct access to heaven silent, even in the face of abuse. A young woman in her 20s who was once a member recalled how she was drawn in by promises of spiritual development. She was informed that she would be included in a select inner circle that would aid in reviving the community. However, the dream quickly became a nightmare after joining. In the ministry, she put in long hours up to 14 or 16 hours a day without receiving compensation, cleaning, cooking, planning events, scrubbing bathrooms, and even doing personal tasks for Taylor. Her life turned into a life of servitude. Others repeated her story. "We weren't volunteers. We were slaves in the name of God." One man testified that he felt pressured to sell his house and donate the proceeds after he joined the ministry. He was promised that God would reward his sacrifice a hundredfold. A few years later, he was abandoned, homeless, and broke. Taylor displayed expensive cars and mansions that were bought with church funds, but the manipulation went beyond money. Family ties were purposefully broken off. In order to divert followers from their divine mission, followers were told that parents, siblings, and children were all demonic influences. After their children joined Taylor's ministry, some parents claimed they lost all communication with them for years. One mother sobbed as she related how her daughter would not talk to her, saying that God, through Taylor, had told her to break off contact. There was a lot of psychological pressure. Those who questioned Taylor or didn't live up to expectations were publicly humiliated during public shaming sessions, according to former members. According to some, they were warned that disobedience would condemn them to hell. According to others, Taylor forewarned them that if they left the ministry, they would no longer be protected by God and would be vulnerable to death, illness, and curses. Meanwhile, Taylor's personal life stood in stark contrast to the suffering of his followers. According to insiders, he enjoyed expensive cars, expensive vacations, and designer suits that cost thousands of dollars. They claimed that Taylor benefited from sumptuous meals and even had servants waiting on him round the clock, while many members lived in small, dilapidated quarters. However, the use of hope as a weapon was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the testimonies. Desperation drove many followers to join JMM. They were sick, broke, heartbroken, or searching for meaning. Taylor promised them miracles. He asserted that he could ensure eternal life, eradicate poverty, and cure cancer. These promises were irresistible to those who were at their lowest. However, many ended up with broken spirits, broken families, and broken finances rather than healing. A terrible picture of life at JMI was depicted by these testimonies. What ought to have been a place of community and faith turned into a system of exploitation where disobedience was penalized, sacrifice was taken advantage of, and loyalty was required. After hearing these accounts, investigators came to the conclusion that there was more going on here than a few financial errors or poor management. This was systemic abuse stretching across years and involving millions of dollars. The testimonies became key evidence in the FBI's case, showing not just the financial fraud, but the human suffering behind it. Even though these tales were horrifying, they were only one piece of the puzzle, because the investigators' next big question was straightforward. What happened to all that money? And some of the most startling revelations in this whole scandal were made possible by the response to that question. When the FBI began dissecting Joshua Media Ministries International's financial records, they weren't just looking for sloppy bookkeeping. They sought evidence of criminal activity, and they discovered something astounding. On paper, JMMI presented itself as a faith-based charity. Its purported goals were to help underserved communities, perform healing services, and share the gospel. Donors were informed that their money would support humanitarian efforts, outreach initiatives, and revival activities. However, upon further investigation, the money trail revealed an entirely different picture. Millions of dollars in alleged ministry donations were being embezzled into an extravagant lifestyle that seemed more appropriate for a celebrity than a preacher, according to court filings and financial documents that were leaked. Luxury cars, high-end fashion, million-dollar estates, and even private chefs. According to reports, they were all financed by individuals who believed they were giving to God. The purchase of automobiles was one of the most startling findings. Testimonies claim that Taylor's ministry possessed a lavish fleet of vehicles, including a Rolls-Royce, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Bentley. These weren't your average ministry vehicles for outreach or travel. They were status symbols, the sort of vehicles you might find parked outside a mansion in Hollywood rather than a religious nonprofit's headquarters. The expenditures continued after that. Investigators found that Taylor controlled a number of real estate properties, including opulent mansions worth millions of dollars. While Taylor lived in luxury with personal staff, one former member recalled being forced to live in a small, crowded house with other volunteers. While donors were informed that the ministry was having difficulty meeting basic needs, some properties reportedly had private theaters, swimming pools, and sophisticated security systems. Another significant expense was designer apparel. According to court documents, Taylor was partial to expensive accessories, designer shoes, and suits that were custom-tailored. According to insiders, he spent tens of thousands of dollars a year on his wardrobe alone, even though he preached about humility from the pulpit. The alleged misappropriation of funds for personal indulgences, however, was possibly the most outrageous revelation. Former members testified that Taylor enjoyed spa treatments, cosmetic enhancements, and extravagant dining experiences, all charged to the ministry. One whistleblower reported seeing receipts for thousands of dollars worth of steakhouse meals, frequently served with pricey wine bottles. These disclosures were a sharp contrast to Taylor's reputation as a holy and selfless man. Additionally, the FBI discovered questionable trends in cross-border transactions. Significant amounts of money were transferred between accounts, some of which were offshore, which raised suspicions of possible money laundering and tax evasion. Investigators found differences between Taylor's actual lifestyle and what JMMY reported to the IRS as nonprofit expenses. It appeared to federal authorities to be more of a shell corporation intended to transfer tax-free contributions into private wealth than a true ministry. This went beyond simple carelessness with money. The scale of the fraud was enormous. Furthermore, the victims weren't anonymous investors or taxpayers. They were regular folks, young adults, retirees, single mothers, and struggling families who gave up their savings in the hope of contributing to God's kingdom. An elderly woman gave a heartbreaking testimony in which she acknowledged that she gave away her retirement fund because she believed Taylor's assurances of divine blessing would take care of her. Rather, she became insolvent and had to depend on family members to make ends meet. In the meantime, Taylor was seen grinning as though nothing was amiss as she got out of a fancy car while sporting a designer suit. It was damning evidence for investigators. The $50 million financial trail painted a picture of systematic exploitation, one where faith was weaponized as a fundraising tool. Each dollar used to finance Taylor's excesses was a betrayal of trust, a breach of promise, and a victim abandoned. This is where it becomes even more startling, though. Investigators discovered additional troubling allegations as they attempted to solve the financial puzzle. Claims that some of the ministry's unpaid workers weren't just victims of fraud, but victims of something closer to human trafficking. The turning point in this case, from a financial scandal to a full-fledged federal criminal investigation, was that revelation. The picture was clear by the time the FBI concluded their investigation. David E. Taylor's ministry wasn't just a house of worship, it was an exploitative home. Federal authorities knew they had enough evidence to take action after former followers accused them of living in slavery-like conditions. Testimonies of abuse increased, and millions of dollars went missing. The impact of the arrest was thunderous, but the actual arrest was quiet. Federal agents surrounded one of Taylor's opulent homes early one morning. Black SUVs were seen pulling up, according to the neighbors. The image of Taylor being led out in handcuffs and the presence of agents wearing FBI-branded jackets. He had portrayed himself for years as an untouchable, God-selected man above all earthly authority. In a cruel irony, he was now merely another defendant in a long line of religious leaders who were charged with praying for their own flock. The arrest news spread like wildfire. The story made headlines all over the country. David E. Taylor, a cult leader, was arrested in a $50 million fraud and slavery case. It was a devastating shock to his followers. Some argued that it was a demonic attack on God's chosen servant and refused to believe it. For survivors, however, it was a long-awaited moment of justice and vindication. The charges were detailed in court documents: conspiracy, labor trafficking, tax evasion, and wire fraud. Taylor was portrayed by prosecutors as the mastermind of a multi-decade-long plot that used faith as a weapon to manipulate and take advantage of the weak. If found guilty, he might be imprisoned for decades or even the rest of his life. But it was not only the criminal element that was most noticeable, but also the symbolic one. Taylor presented himself as a direct messenger of God and claimed to have met Jesus in person for years. He had avoided it all his career, but now he had to deal with it. Responsibility, just a courtroom, a judge, and the evidence against him: no visions, no divine interventions. Broader concerns regarding the culture of megachurches and celebrity preachers were also raised by the arrest. How many more were out there taking advantage of their followers while hiding behind the guise of religion? How could there have been no accountability for this for so long? Above all, how can we prevent vulnerable individuals from re-entering the same traps? There is more to David E. Taylor's story than the demise of a contentious religious figure. It serves as a warning about the perils of unbridled authority, gullibility, and the disastrous results of manipulation. Fundamentally, it concerns people, regular men and women, who trusted a person they thought was a prophet only to be exploited, deceived, and cast aside. There is more to the FBI's case against Taylor than money. For those who were silenced, for families shattered, and for lives irrevocably altered, it is about justice. Furthermore, this case serves as a reminder that everyone is subject to the law, even self-styled prophets. What do you think then? Did David E. Taylor just pose as a religious fraudster? Or do you think this story is more complicated than it first appears? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. I'd like to hear your viewpoint. Please remember to like this video, subscribe for more in-depth stories, and share it with others if you found this in-depth analysis eye-opening. This will help the truth get out there, because history becomes more difficult to repeat the more people are aware of cases like this.